Opening slide graphic text. Enhancing learning and skill development. Title, Session 5, Providing Information and Feedback. With Milton Tyree. Logos, Belonging Matters, talksthatmatter.net.
So we've talked about method content. Now we're going to dig into informing strategies. When I'm doing full-day workshops on instruction with people, I'm always sure that we start informing strategies first thing in the morning, because there's just so much to learn about it, so much to be thinking about at the same time. So that's what we're doing here too. We're kicking off tonight with new content on informing strategies. And so the first part of this is we're going to be looking at the difference in reinforcement and influence, communicating information and motivation. What do we mean by information? Talking about natural and typical motivation versus artificial reinforcement. This principle of no news is good news, which is really, really powerful. Instead of saying no, referencing the desired action, have examples of all of this, timing of giving information, and then ways of providing information, whether you're demonstrating the task, whether you're talking to the person about information on the task, whether you're using a modeling kind of movement, or you're using a gesture, or you're physically guiding people. So we'll talk about rules for all of this. And the idea of this shift of ownership, that if you know a lot about the task, like the Japanese t-shirt folding, and you've learned it yourself, and you've written out steps for it, so you can think of, how am I stopping this video in my head, you know? Then you're ready to teach the task. And the shift of ownership is you have all the information about this task, and the person you're teaching has no information. And so gradually, over a period of different times, we call them trials of folding the shirt, you will have a lot of information, and you're not losing it when you give it to somebody else, but they're getting gradually more information. So you have this shift of ownership. You have all the ownership when you do the demonstration of folding the t-shirt, but by the time the person has learned it, you have entirely shifted that ownership to that person. Now, I'm going to start off by showing an excerpt, a 12-minute excerpt of one of Marc's videos. This actually was from the last of 7 videos that he made around what he called Try Another Way. And so this talks about a number of different principles. He talks about no news is good news. He talks about content influence versus process influence. And one of our early breakout sessions, you all will have some time to talk about what's in this video and additional things in your small groups. And I'll take a little time after I show this just for some initial reactions in chat. All right, let's watch this.
Look familiar? At some time or another, we've all used this stuff, or something like it. Too often, it's become the currency between a buyer and a seller. The marketplace is the trainer-learner situation. The name of the game is reinforcement. Most trainers rely almost exclusively on some kind of reinforcement system as the primary source of power for training people. Here we are, the beginning of the 7th film in this training series. This is almost the first time it's come up. It's no accident that I saved it for last. We're going to take a close look at reinforcement and find out what you can buy with it and what it costs. The first part of our rule of reinforcement says the best reinforcers are natural. Natural reinforcers are those that are found where you ultimately expect their behavior to occur. If you're working with a person in a vocational setting, and you assume the place where he's going to be working most of his life has a foreman who every few minutes is going to come along and say, very good, I like what you're doing, then that's a natural reinforcer. Whatever will be where the person is ultimately going to do the thing that you're teaching him, that's natural. If you're teaching people who you expect to live in an institutional setting with a strong token economy, and that token economy is going to be there all of their lives, then that's natural. I say natural reinforcers are the best because when they're used, there's no problem transferring. If the trainer uses what's going to be there when he walks away, then at least for that part of the learner is already there. Another reason why I say natural reinforcers are the best is because they imply natural people. There's another way to look at what natural means. There are many times where, well-intentioned, we try to give someone a boost by saying something nice about what they're doing. And a lot of times what they're doing isn't much. I wonder how many times the person is saying to himself or to herself, if she thinks that's so good, then what must she think of me? When you reinforce a person for something they perceive as a low-status task, you're reinforcing a low self-concept. Okay, let's get back to the third part of the rule of reinforcement, which says, when the learner knows the trainer is attending, no news is good news. If I'm working with you and you know that I'm paying attention to what you're doing, there's no question I'm not off smoking or drinking coffee or answering telephone calls. I'm right here. And occasionally I'm reaching in and putting your hand in a particular position or touching your shoulder or saying something to you. What are you saying to yourself while I'm sitting there silent and virtually motionless? I must be doing fine. That feels good. And that's reinforcing. No news is good news is sort of the opposite of what I see so often. And that is where people make reinforcement junkies out of learners, where a heavy emphasis is on reinforcement procedures. The trainer is making the learner very dependent. The trainer is saying, I'll let you know when you're right. No news is good news says, I'll let you know when you're wrong, and in a way that doesn't hurt. If you're going to use no news is good news, what are the conditions? First of all, no news is good news works very well when you're teaching someone something that they find valuable. When the task provides motivation, you don't have to. It's also interesting that for most of those tasks, once the person has learned them and moves into the real environment, the task or the people around him provide all the reinforcement that's needed for him to keep right on going. Another important condition for using no news is good news is that learners shouldn't be allowed to work at tasks that they're still making errors on in the absence of a trainer. If the learner hasn't reached criterion yet, if he hasn't shown you that he knows the task, and you walk away and he makes an error and you're not there to provide him with some correction, then no news is bad news. If you have to get up and walk away while a person is still making errors on a task, either take the task or the learner with you. It's only fair. The last condition that I'd like to mention for using no news is good news is that if you're relying on silence, on a very quiet interaction between the trainer and the learner, when you have to correct an error, do it in a way that doesn't hurt. Now let's take a look at something that in some respects is very much different and in some ways very much like what we've been talking about so far. I'd like to talk about influence. The word influence describes very nicely just about everything that a trainer does to a learner. Influence can take place before the learner acts, while the learner is acting, or after he has acted. But I'd like to center in here on a different aspect of influence, on two kinds. One kind of influence is where the trainer intends to focus on the knowledge of the task. And I'd like to call that content influence. The other is where the trainer intends to focus on feelings that the learner has about the task or about doing the task, and I call that process influence. When you focus on process influence, you support the long-standing tradition in our society that there must be a superior-inferior relationship between trainers and learners. Process influence is manipulation. It's buying and selling behaviors and feelings. One of the two parties in the transaction always has the control. That obviously means you've got something that he needs. You're on top and he's on the bottom. Somebody's got to win and somebody's got to lose. How can we expect people to take their place beside us in society when most of the ways we have for supposedly helping to get them there force them to recognize in one way or another their subservient position? How can you have a balanced relationship with someone when all of the transactions are purchased or sold? Another practical consideration about process influence is that it's very distracting. If the trainer is constantly rewarding or punishing or trying to tell somebody how happy they are or what they want, it's pretty hard to focus on the task. And all of those attempts to get a person to do it cost credibility. If you're handing that stuff out so easily, it must be pretty cheap. And one other thing, it's exhausting. It's exhausting for the trainer. It's exhausting for the learner to be constantly trying to play on someone's emotions and motivations or to have them played upon. Now, let's look at the other side of the coin. When your focus of attention, when the intent of your focus is on content influence, and that is providing the person with knowledge about the task, the training is so much less cluttered. All that stuff gets out of the way, and the task can be dealt with. It's a shorter distance to independence. The person comes through the learning process without having to rely very much on outside motivation. He can confidently move into the actual doing part of the task where the trainer isn't around without having to give all that stuff up. Another thing that happens when you focus on content influence is that much more useful information will be communicated. Now comes the punchline. When you focus on content influence, it provides an environment and an opportunity for the trainer and the learner to develop a balanced relationship. Respect, dignity in both directions. The learner has a chance to appreciate the task instead of being barraged with why he should appreciate the task. The learner comes to perceive the trainer as someone who is there to work with him and provide him with information, not to act as an overlord. The trainer gets at least as much out of it as the learner. With the focus on content influence, a trainer can discover that the learner is a genuine receiver of knowledge, not something that information is stuffed into like dressing in a turkey. When the trainer focuses on content influence, a much higher level of real, natural, deep, valued reinforcement comes into play. You try it, and you'll experience it for yourself. Now's a good time to ask ourselves where we've been and how far we've come. We started out with Try Another Way, a philosophy statement that said there are people out there that are capable of learning so much more than anybody ever thought. It also said really what this last few minutes has said, and that is that the relationship between a trainer and a learner can be balanced and can be lovely. Then as we moved into the training series, you were given an organizational structure, that bag of tricks, for organizing the different pieces of the system. Then we spent the rest of the films talking about those pieces, about the operations within the system, the formats and the feedback and the rules. We saw wonderful people doing some very inspiring things. And here we are, back at philosophy again, tying all of that stuff to value structures, to the relationships between people and the feelings of people. You can't have a technology outside of a set of values, outside of a set of beliefs about who people are, about what the good life is. If this training series has been successful, then it's been able to define and emphasize the crucial relationship between what we know as trainers and what we feel as individuals, and how those two things combine and interact to result in important things happening to important people. Thank you.
So what an amazing man Marc Gold was, and really ahead of his time. So in around 1976, when Marc would have been making this video, I was sitting in behavior modification class at the university, you know, studying B.F. Skinner and token economies and positive reinforcement, how you need to always tell people that they're doing good or they'll be discouraged and it won't be good for their self-concept. So it was quite a bit different. And I know when I was first exposed to this, I thought, what? What are you talking about? Making people reinforcement junkies, you know? But the more I reflected on it, the more it really made a lot of sense to me. And so one of the things that's interesting to me about this idea that Marc was talking about, you know, so many decades ago, is that, you know, whereas you don't see token economies running around like you do in 1976, there still is a lot of behavioristic kinds of stuff going on. And just, you know, one of the things that's interesting to me is how there have been people outside of the disability world talking about what Marc talked about with content influence and process influence, and making people reinforcement junkies, you know, using reinforcement instead of motivation. And one of the books is Punished by Rewards. I don't know if anybody's ever read this before, by Alfie Cohen. And the subtitle is, the title is Punished by Rewards, and the subtitle is The Trouble with Gold Stars, Incentive Plans, A's, Praise, and Other Bribes. And so he doesn't talk about disability in this a bit. You know, he talks about things like the study where if you really want to be sure that to kill elementary school students' love of reading, then offer pizza coupons for whoever reads the most books, because you'll be reinforcing reading the most books, you know, and you're getting the shortest books and flipping through them and essentially killing the love of reading unintentionally, right? And the same thing, you know, like if you reward car salesmen, whoever sells the most cars, with a trip to Hawaii, then what's their motivation going to be going throughout the day? It's going to be to sell the most cars possible, not offer the best customer service to people, you know, which is what you really would want to see. Anyhow, it's just kind of an interesting parallel. So content influence is the intent of providing knowledge and information about a task. Process influence is the focus on feelings about the task or the situation. So process influence have this image of a one-way street, whereas content influence is at the heart of developing a balanced relationship with people. So this is part of what I was thinking about when I was asked the question about helping somebody develop a talk, where a lot of that wouldn't rely on a performance task kinds of things. What's your relationship with the person? How are you giving the person information? So what do we mean by information? That's fair to ask. So here we're talking to verbal, signed, gestural, written, physical actions provided by a trainer designed to communicate correct performance to a learner. And we have this difference around motivation. Motivation requires to all getting back to that naturally referenced, all naturally existing features of a setting that are used to promote initiative, cooperation, enthusiasm, and other desired behaviors. So I was doing a job analysis at Worldport, UPS Worldport. It's the biggest UPS operation in the world, is right outside of Louisville because we're kind of centrally located in a lot of ways in the country. So planes that fly all over the world, the flights originate from Louisville. Thus, it's called Worldport. And one of the things, I just spent part of a shift with a crew just to see how they did their task and different kinds of things. But one of the first things I noticed was this big team building thing at the beginning of the day. This was the crew that was going to unload the planes and get stuff to the right people, in the part of the country where the sorting was. And, so they did some exercises together. They did like these team building kinds of things. We're going to unload, more packages than any of the other teams. So that would be an example, my point is, of natural motivation that was used for teams at Worldport. So going back to, we talked about this last week, when teaching a task somebody finds interesting, the motivation is built in. So we want to look at helping people learn things that they have intrinsic motivation to learn. Intrinsic motivation relates to one's personal feeling, satisfaction, interest, as Mark would say, things that people do without being asked. And if we're looking at work, since that's where I camp out a lot, what is naturally motivating at work? Well, those team meetings, like I was just talking about at Worldport, pay, benefits, socialization with your coworkers, recreation things, softball leagues, whatever. Supervisory acknowledgement, which is a little different than getting praise for every movement you make. Satisfaction in task performance and completion, just intrinsic satisfaction. Wow. I learned that, I did that. Intrinsic interest in the general type of work and in specific tasks. And so that contrasted with what I was taught to use at the university, artificial reinforcement all over the place, the purposeful arrangement of events that occur after a certain behavior designed in such a way to increase or decrease, punish or reward, the likelihood of that behavior occurring again. And so I have in bold here, practically, the use of artificial reinforcement in a community setting. Well, it's artificial at best and dependency building and demeaning and stigmatizing at worst. So we need to think about what it all looks like. So these would be some examples of artificial reinforcement. Good job. Well, not that you would never say that to somebody, but just continually and excessively. Great. Wow. Food rewards, gold stars, check marks, constant attention. All right, this idea of no news is good news is pretty interesting. And it's something that has to be learned over time. It's more than a conversation. But I've found myself teaching people things before in different kinds of roles. And after I understood no news is good news, it's like if you're just looking at the task and you're watching what they're doing, what the learner is doing, and as long as they're doing fine, you're not saying anything, that silence is really startling to people. If they're used to somebody always saying, good job, Bill, or they'll look at me, am I doing okay? And so I'll say, well, you're doing great. And I'm not going to say anything unless you need information from me. If you're getting it right, I'm not going to say anything. And that's usually a lot more than one conversation because people are so accustomed to hearing it, good job after every step. That's it. Good, right, go on. And then and people literally won't move until they hear approval of something. So that, like you were talking about, we're just talking about Fiona, is one of the ways that people develop dependence on other people's approval. So, Mark said what he sees so often is no news is is bad news. So that's not what we want. No news is good news. As a result, errors become acceptable and expected part of teaching and learning. So part of this, part of no news is good news, is thinking about how you give information. And one of the things that Marc taught us, which was really interesting, is he would say, as you heard him say, I think, provide information in a way that doesn't hurt. And so one of the ways that he said hurts is telling people no, because all no does is stop somebody. It doesn't tell them what to do. So he said, so instead of saying no, just if you're going to talk to people, just reference the desired action, just say what it is they need to do instead. Because no just says you screwed up. And it's kind of jarring, even if you say it nicely, no, that's not it. So that's not it. But the question is then, what is it? And so that's one of the things that Marc helped us learn. I mentioned Sam last week, a young man I assisted in getting a job at Saddle Lake Equestrian. And I also said that the person who did the instruction there was Mike. But before Mike provided instruction for Sam, I asked him to show me how he was going to teach the jobs. And so that's what he did. I spent a couple of mornings with Mike learning about the tasks that Sam was going to learn. And I was real honest with Mike. I said, now Sam knows about horses and I don't. I know the difference between a horse and a cow. So it's going to be easier for Sam to learn things than me. But I really want to get a handle on how you teach things and how somebody learns these tasks. And he was fine with that. So one of the tasks was we were going up in a pasture to check the watering systems for the horses. And so we were driving this little, or Mike was driving this little four-wheeler and I was sitting up front. And so he stopped at the first gate. He hopped out from driving. He unlatched the gate and opened it. And then we drove through and then he got out again and pulled it back and latched it again. And I thought, well, I'm a city boy, but I can do that. So the next gate we got to, I said, let me get this one. So I hopped out and I started to unlatch the gate and it was the wrong one. And he said, green gate, just real pleasantly, green gate. And I thought, oh man, how could I be so stupid? But I did, but I really, it's thought, he didn't say, oh, come on, think about it. And really looking at where we were going, the black gate was the one we needed to go through. The green gate just went to an adjacent pasture that would have no utility to what we were doing at all. And so what Mike did was he didn't say, no, not that one. He just referenced the desired action. That's exactly what Marc said to do. And I just found that so interesting. He did that all of the time with me. He'd be showing me how to get grain for the horses. He'd say, so be sure this horse gets 1.5 cups of grain. And I would measure it incorrectly. It would be 2 cups. And he would point to it. He'd say, be sure it comes up to this line, 1.5 cups. He would always reference the desired action. He never made me feel stupid for not knowing what to do. And I asked him about this. I said, I teach teaching, and what you do all of the time with me is so lovely, and it will work so nicely with Sam, who's so used to people beating him down. It will work so nicely with him just to reference if he starts to make a mistake. Before he makes the mistake, give him the desired information. I said, how did you learn to do that? And he said, well, I had a supervisor once in a landscaping company, and that's the way he taught all of us our work. And I just thought that was really good. And so that's why I do the same thing now. Reference the desired action. Okay, and the other thing we want to think about is when to give the information. So systematic instruction is not trial and error instruction. We don't wait for somebody to make an error. We try to get involved before they make the error to give the right action, just like Mike did. I started reaching for the black gate. He goes, green gate, so that I don't unlatch the black gate. Or before I would give the horse the wrong amount of grain, be sure you go up to this line, 1.5 cups of grain, you see. So really his timing on that was just right also. Our approach to learning involves getting needed information about correct performance before the error is made. That way, people don't practice errors. Like every time you work through the task, as much as possible, you've worked through the task without making an error. So one of the principles here that Marc helped us think about it is what he called timing. And so it's when you give the information. So if you're teaching a task and you're doing the same task again, like folding a t-shirt, and you're going to be working on that repeatedly, you want to, early on in the task, if somebody starts to make a mistake in terms of how they're grasping the shirt or where they're grasping the shirt, just when you see the person start to reach for the wrong part, you want to give them information right then. And we'll talk about how in a minute. It might be telling them, it might be pointing to the part of the shirt up here. You don't say no, because that doesn't give them information, but, oh, grasp it up here. See, that would be, and point at the same time. That'd be a way of giving information on a desired action before the person makes an error. You see, that way, every time they work through the sequence of the steps on the shirt, they're doing it the same way again and again. Cycle constancy of method, you see. Now, the other thing that Marc taught us is that early in acquisition, like the first time the person does the shirt and they're starting to reach to the wrong section of the shirt, you want to be sure you give the information right away so they don't make the error. But after they've done 3 or 4 shirts, you think about timing of when you give the information, because you want them to be thinking about what they've learned on the subsequent trials. And so if you see somebody just kind of pause and they're trying to think about, okay, now do I go up here? Then you give the person time to make a decision, because a lot of times they'll make the correct decision and then just keep going, you see. But you still don't want the person to make an error. So the rule to timing is you want to think about getting involved in giving information after the decision, but before the error. Here's some other conditions around timing. You know, obviously you need to be present, same as with no news is good news. You do need to be in a position to observe before intervening, and you need to rely on no news is good news, so people know that they have confidence to move forward without you saying anything. And the instructor needs to offer information on correctness again, rather than critique. And all of this builds to a shift in ownership, where you start off with all the information and gradually the learner gets more. So here we're going to talk about different ways of giving information. The very first thing that we recommend that anybody get, if they're learning a new task, like folding the t-shirt, Japanese t-shirt folding method, is a demonstration of the task. Here's the task. I'm going to show you the Japanese t-shirt folding method, and then just real deliberately working through the method, not looking at the steps. You know the steps, and the steps are for you. Real deliberately just working through the steps and then saying, okay, now you try. So demonstration of performance gives people an initial image. People who have vision, of course, who can see what you're doing. It's the initial information that they're getting on the task. Okay, one way to give information is verbal information, talking to the learner and providing information for correct performance. So verbal information, in the mic example, green gate was exactly what I needed. You know, I mean, it's what did the trick, right? Green gate. Oh, it's green right here. Okay, wrong gate. So verbal information, another aspect of this that we're paying more and more attention to nowadays than we did in, you know, when Marc first started teaching systematic instruction, 45 years ago. We pay a lot more attention to what is typical in the culture, and a lot of teaching is through people talking. So one of the rules for verbal information is keep it concise and targeted. So verbal information that you might use around grasping the t-shirt would be pinch. That would be a piece of verbal information. Or hold it here. You see, real brief and concise. In other words, you don't want to get into a long running commentary. Gosh, when I was learning this, I used to reach over here and pick it up, but this is the right place. Pick it here. Crisp and concise. It was one of the things that Marc noted got in the way of people's learning is that there were too many words. And this is true for all of us in learning, but probably especially true for people who have learning anyhow. We also want to, if somebody really doesn't learn well from giving verbal information, then we wouldn't use it. But that would be, I think, more the exception than the rule. Then you never mix conversation with verbal information either. Now, I think one of the things that's natural to fall into when you're teaching a task is just, did you see that game last night? Wow, what a beautiful day it is, Don't mix conversation with information. Just a couple verbal tips, but you might give information to the person verbally. You might model the action. So like positioning of fingers, like thumb on top, pinch it, thumb on top. And you might use the gesture while you're saying it, or you might just, or the model of what it looks like. That might be sufficient information for somebody. Just, it's like they're looking at you, reach in right away. A modeling gesture. Turn it over, Or like on the shirt. Just some kind of modeling gesture that models what they need, what the learner needs to be doing. Now, gesture probably would use a lot to give information on folding the t-shirt, like the position. If somebody started to reach for the wrong position, to actually touch the part of the shirt where she needed to grasp. That would be an example of a gesture. And looking at fading power is another really important part of all of this. It ties right in with transfer of ownership. So we talk about specific gestures, which would be actually touching that midpoint between the collar and the shoulder of the shirt, just actually touching it. And the next time, if the person starts to make the same error, you want to get in there ahead of time, but just point in that direction. And they would remember, oh yeah, I know what that means. It's up here, you see? So you want to gradually fade the power of the information you're giving to. And another way to give information is physically guiding. And if you remember last week, Marc teaching Barbara the bicycle brake, he used quite a bit of physical information with Barbara, like gently grasping her hand and having her, directing her to pick up the part or to position the part, like the bearing correctly in the hub. He would use verbal information. So the thing to remember with physical information is that it always involves touching or gently manipulating the learner's hands just for purpose of providing information. It never is a forced, like, here, move your hand like that. You're never forcing people or working against learner resistance. And some people are very sensitive to being touched. And if physical information, would cause people to recoil or something, then you wouldn't use physical information. I found that to be more the exception than the rule also. Even with people who may be predisposed to recoiling when they're touched, that the way we're talking about physical information is just that. It's just showing people how it goes, Now, this is something else that Marc mentioned, which is a really important principle of learning. And he mentioned it in the bicycle brake. I'm going to ask people to put in chat if you remember what he said criterion for the bicycle brake was. In our research, we know that if people do this many brakes under this condition, then they really know the task. Does anybody remember what he said? That would be, I remember because I've seen that clip, you know, probably hundreds of times. But does anybody just offhand remember what he said criterion was for learning the bicycle brake? Okay, that's fine. But what he said was, we know that people, it wasn't 10, but good guess. It was 6. It was 6 consecutive breaks without error, without information. So if we saw Eugene or Barbara, who you both saw doing bicycle brakes at the end, we learned that if you saw that person do 6 breaks without anybody giving any information, the trainer giving no information on the brake, if they did that 6 consecutive times without error, then they know it. That doesn't mean they'll never make a mistake on another brake, but it means they know it well enough to work on it independently. They know the task. The learner knows the task, which is such an important principle, because that really caused me to think so many times, you know, you see somebody on a job and it's a fairly complicated task. They're, you know, I don't know, preparing packets for an office or something, and all of these papers have to be put in a certain way and punched a certain way. And so you demonstrate for the person, or the secretary or administrative assistant demonstrates for the person and watches the person do the task. And they see the learner do the task, or their new employee do the task correctly one time, and they go, oh, great, you've got it. And they walk off. Well, they haven't done more than one. It could be luck, you know, and it doesn't mean the person knows it well enough. So you want to think, well, how many times would you need to watch somebody do this consecutively without any help to know that the person really knows it? Because this is what happens if people don't meet criterion. They practice the task incorrectly. So they're practicing it wrong. And that's going into their muscle memory. And then somebody goes, oh gosh, we have to redo 20 of these now. Now they're getting critiqued for their performance, when actually, whose fault was it? It was the person providing information, assumed they knew the task when they didn't. Now there's an SRV theme that's not part of Marc Gold and Associates systematic instruction that really fits with what we're talking about here. And it's this idea of imitation and modeling. You know, it's just a powerful way of learning. We all do it all the time. We watch other people do something that we want to know how to do, or we want to know what's expected. And it's natural. It's, you know, it's one of the problems with congregated and segregated programs, is that you have a lot of people who want to learn a skill, but the other people, like when I worked at the Sheltered Workshop or the ADE, you know, and have a crew of people all learning a new task, and they weren't working with other people who knew the task. They were working with other people who also were striving to learn the task all at the same time. And so, you know, but, you know, you can think, well, if that task were a suitable task, interesting task for that learner, and they were surrounded by other people who knew how to do it, that would be a very powerful way of them learning it. Not the only way of them learning it, but a very powerful way of them learning it. So it's one of the problems with congregation and segregation, that people are watching other people who also don't know how to do the task. And it's just a fairly non-stigmatizing, natural way for people to learn. So one of my dear colleagues in this work, whom I've learned so much from in SRV theory, is Darcy Elks. And her daughter, you see pictured here in the purple dress. Mary is an adult now, but when she was a little girl, you know, one of the things that Darcy really paid attention to was who were the models for Mary. You could look at Mary looking at the other little girl here, you see, to know what to do. Imitation and modeling is just a very natural way of learning. And so, you know, Mary never darkened the door of a congregated, segregated special ed program. And that was one of the reasons. It's how she developed her interests. And so this is just a picture. Mary enjoyed dance a lot. And my little girl did too, but kind of gave it up after she was 5 years old. But Mary did not. She stuck with it. It's another good example of imitation and modeling. You see Mary back as a young woman here, and probably in high school. Back right. The same thing I talked about, Sam learning so well from Keith. And this also relates to this, the relationship in imitation and modeling, that people are with other people they admire and would like to be more like. It's like similar to the SRV theme I mentioned of interpersonal identification. People will, I remember when I was a high school teacher in the congregated segregated class I had at the high school, one of my students, Brian, this was of a day when high school teachers would sometimes wear ties, not all the time, but so as a high school teacher, some days I would wear a tie. Students never wore ties at this high school, but if I would wear a tie on Monday, then Brian, one of my students, would show up with a tie often on Tuesday, which I guess would kind of be mixed for Brian since other students didn't wear ties. But my point here isn't whether he wore a tie or not. It was like, he was imitating and modeling me. And I think part of it was this interpersonal identification that we had. So one of the things you want to think about with imitation and modeling, it's a piece of learning. It's not all of it, but it's a piece of it. And so like any of us who are parents, particularly around teenage years, we want to be careful about what it is that people are imitating and modeling, because there are good models of behaviors and performance and ones that aren't. So this has a lot of implication for work, when you're looking at work at different businesses, who will be the model workers. So just in summary, just some of the points here, to not forget the power of imitation and modeling. And sometimes people need attention to what to model and, discerning good models. And especially it's important for people who are vulnerable to, picking up things that wouldn't be helpful from people who aren't good models. And it helps promote people's sense of identification with people who are good models. And I think this is so important in our work when we're out around in the world, in the community, and if we are responsible for teaching somebody something or being their ally, to just think that other people are watching us to see how we're giving information. What's our tone of voice? Are we referencing the desired action or telling people no? Are we thinking about the timing of information? All of that, because people will look to us. So I think, I got to know Mike before he got to know Sam, although we got to know Sam before he started work, but I was there when Sam was learning his job. And so, I needed to be really thinking about messages I was teaching Mike about how to be with Sam, because he would be looking at me,
Closing slide graphic text, with thanks to Milton Tyree. Produced by Belonging Matters. Belonging Matters makes every effort to provide accurate and up-to-date material. However, information is subject to change, and our material is for reference only. This video was produced on the land of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation. This video was made possible with the support of an information and capacity building grant through the Department of Social Services. Logos, Belonging Matters, talksthatmatter.net.